Sherry, I want to ask you specifically, just building on a couple of comments you made earlier, this question. You talked about how right now at USAID you're working on more of the poorest of the poor and recognizing that beyond credit they need savings and insurance, and that women in particular need the financial access, the business skills, but also the mentoring. So the mentoring piece is really fascinating because it's so outside of the typical business model for an MFI, or who really owns that piece, who should be delivering that. It seems like that's an area where you would need to find partnerships or open up mindsets about how to deliver solutions. So how do you address that in your work?
Great, well, thank you. That's a fabulous question, and my response to that question is actually part of my response to the broader question about partnerships, and that is, many of us start in the world assuming that there's this one poor person over here who needs assistance, and then there's me over here who has, very fortunate to have an abundance, and I'm trying to think about how to connect just me and that one poor person. And in fact, as I've been working in this field for so long, I've grown to recognize and really appreciate the fact that there's almost like a market of organizations and institutions. There's almost like our market framework that we need lots of different players and actors to get involved, with each of them playing their role. So you take the individual who's a taxpayer, and your taxpayer then, of course, is helping to support USAID as an agency that's got this mission to provide development assistance. And we tend to work with large international NGOs and partner organizations, like a group like CARE, let's say. And I mean, there really are hundreds of partners, is how USAID gets its money out to the field. But those large international organizations often are then teaming up with a local organization or a local NGO or a local university or a local business training operation. And those are then actually often not working with individual women, but might be working with groups of women. And so you have all these different layers, this food chain of sorts that is all kind of going on and all bubbling forth, each providing their role and purpose that are connecting the individual supporter with the kind of impact in the field. And that becomes very, very true, just as you're saying about the mentoring and business training, because historically microfinance really focused a lot on providing just the financial service, and that focus on financial service was because they had a desire to get to certain levels of efficiency. And therefore, as we look at providing those other kinds of business mentoring, you're actually needing to introduce another partner in the equation. Now, in some instances, you might have a micro lender opening up its own little training arm. But in other instances, there are other organizations that are really taking on that role of developing appropriate training materials, doing training of trainers, once again, working through village groups to try and reach more and more people, so that you're really, it's not just the one-on-one kind of intervention. And so lots of different strategies need to be employed. But it's important to recognize that no one person acts as an individual or as an island, that there's as vibrant as a network of players that you think of in the private sector that exists in the NGO and the civic sector, that's involved with linking up resources and getting them down to the ground, and getting them down to the ground in the ways that they can actually have the greatest impact. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't room for each and every one of you out there, because each and every one of you has a very important role to play in your own community. You have roles to play as advocates vis-a-vis your elected officials. You have a role to play as volunteers, as we've been hearing about, in your own cities or internationally. You have roles to play really as investors. As I was saying, there's increasing web-based options that allow individuals to actually invest in women and invest in microfinance overseas. So there's lots of ways to do things on the one-to-one level, but there's also really, rather than, because sometimes people will be very suspicious of these layers. They'll say, well, I just want to reach that one woman. Well, in fact, it's a whole enabling environment and a whole enabling chain that allows you to kind of reach people that you never could just on your own. And so embracing and sort of working all of this together, I think, is how you can have the greatest impact.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think now we are ready for our audience questions.
I think we have a group full of people here who are, many of us are maybe in the second or third part of our careers as women. Can you help us understand, as there one of you or two of you might help us understand what we can do to help what I think is a generation that's coming up of women who have a much more clear global standing, the fact that they're a part of a world of women and that they want to help but they're not sure. Is there something that we as professionals can do?
That one-to-one mentoring role is really important, and it's probably the most important thing. Or as you say, I think we all feel it. I look at my students and think, gosh, they're so much more world aware than I was. But I still think that our generation in our sort of 50s now, the first generation who have really, well, I guess the second one now, who've been struggling balancing everything, and I think that's clearly going to continue to be a challenge for the generation coming through. But I think also partnering with, whether they're within our own families or in schools, if we're involved with schools, in, sort of projects, doing projects together, whether it's locally or internationally. Because something, and I think Sherry was sort of partly going there in her comments, when we have those one-to-one partnerships, the sort of the two-way learning aspects of them are enormous. So I think for those of us who are getting into our sort of our third stage, as it were, I think that the one-on-one linkages, online type engagement and mentoring possibilities now, and I think that the global giving idea, where one can either be putting bits of money into something, one can be doing volunteering, both online as well as physically with young people. And the ambassador said at that sort of mentoring role, the power of a young woman in Africa or Asia having a mentor, but both directions, I think is enormous. And I think online capability enables us to do that now.
I wonder if this is, I just have maybe a slightly provocative question. What's so inspiring about what you're talking about is the way forward and positive ideas and how to marshal all of these resources and ideas. So I have a slightly on the dark side question. I knew you probably knew one was coming. I deal a lot with war and human rights violations and et cetera. And just as a little story, we're working in the Congo, and we tried very hard. The government reached out to us right after the elections in 2006 when we were there and asked us to help them set up a process for regulating the mining industry in the Congo. Okay, that was a big request. We thought about it. We said, well, we can't hardly say no. It's a big risk. But we undertook that. We got experts involved. We had lawyers lined up. We had the whole thing lined up. And what ended up happening was that the companies went into private backroom talks again. The whole idea was to get this out into the open because there were war years contracts that had been signed including by American companies that with the support of the U.S. State Department. Different administration, but nonetheless. So we were trying to push for this transparency. This company really undermined that process. And as a result, now the government has gone to its worst old ways. And a recent huge contract, First Quantum, was just canceled in a very capricious manner. So there's no investment environment there now. So here's the question, sorry for the long-winded intro, is, can companies be more vocal, first on the issue of war, in prevention of war? Because imagine if 1994, companies had really demanded the U.S. State Department to get in there, to say, war is bad for business. War is bad for business. Help, let's get this diplomacy really ratcheted up. We've got to prevent war. That's A, because that's most of the problems women face have to do, the most egregious ones are from war. That's A. And then B, in the reconstruction and in development, how can our corporations, what you represent, which is the best of our corporations and the best of our, Jane, maybe this is for you. How do we marshal that and make sure that we're not undermining development?
It's a good question. And I would say every company can actually prevent wars. You do have a big role to play. I remember maybe 2 years ago or so when there was a big panel at the Clinton Global Initiative that is a plenary panel on investing in women and girls. And ExxonMobil CEO and chair was on the panel. And Diane Sawyer, very interesting question. And she asked, the panel had Ambassador Revere, Goldman Sachs CEO, ExxonMobil CEO, and some others. So Diane Sawyer said, now that we have two male CEOs on the panel talking about why it's important to invest in women and girls, why don't you ask each other a question? So Goldman Sachs CEO asked ExxonMobil CEO this question. So why it's important for your company who invests in our oil and gasoline fields in the world to invest in women and girls? So he said, look, it's all about business bottom line. We invested in countries where it's most dangerous, it's most unstable. Those oil fields tend to be quite dangerous to work in. So it is to our company's interest to actually make sure that those environments are very stable, safe, and good for our workers and business. Otherwise, the business cost is too high for us to pay for corruption, to cost us to make sure that our workers are safe, there's no violence and all these issues. And the best way to invest that, to create a safe community, is through women, actually. If you make sure that women have jobs, so they have income, they invest in their children's education, so boys, especially teenage boys, will not be running around in the village, have nothing to do, and then cause problems, or become criminals in the future. So it's a very simple theory for the ExxonMobil CEO. That is when we are seeing, when the State Department, this administration especially, really recognizes why it's important to invest in women and girls in the Middle East. Because that's a region when you have a large population of youth. Many of them are unemployed. Think about young guys without jobs. That's trouble. So, no, it's true.
In any country.
In any country, it's not just in any country. Young people without jobs, feeling disappointed, that's when violence and wars begin. So what you do is to make sure that you create jobs and economic opportunities for them. That's where companies' role really is important. When you can invest in a community, making sure that you're creating jobs, everyone has a purpose, has hope. They don't become suicide bombers. They don't become those warriors. So I think it's really important to recognize what your role is, and everyone can prevent a major war.
Absolutely, the role of business is the job creation, and being very, very clear on that, and wherever, particularly if a company's operating in a fragile state, which it's mostly the extractive companies, because a lot of other companies don't go there. And I think often not the multinationals are the problem, but smaller companies who aren't parts of guidelines, etc. But I think that the two most important things, particularly the multinational companies can do, is one is to have very, very clear standards. The business equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, and that whether it's environmental, social, or human rights, I think it is important for big companies to have those standards, and most do now. And then to be transparent about how they're being implemented. But then secondly, the very important sort of both role modeling but influence role then the larger companies can play with local partners, with local government. And so whether it's implementing human rights standards along their value chain or role modeling, hiring women in the workplace. I do spend a fair amount of time in Saudi Arabia, and I've seen firsthand, even in a very, very difficult place like Saudi Arabia, how European and American and Asian companies are role modeling women in the workforce, let alone in the incredibly difficult situations and fragile states where, role modeling certainly isn't enough, but at the absolute minimum, I think companies having to show that they do no harm. So I'm disappointed to hear you say that collectively the mining sector wasn't effective in the Congo, because I think that's the other issue. In some of those situations, you have to work collectively because it's too hard for one company to do it on its own.